incident was about to take place that would shake the foundations of the civilized world.
It is time to open your mind. Time to discover your divine self as we navigate this holographic matrix together. Strap in, cosmic family, as we slide through this wormhole of cosmic information together in search of the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's time to go inside the matrix. With your host, Jimi Brent.
All right, welcome to Inside the Matrix. Today, our guest is Robert Phoenix. Robert is an astrologer, writer, broadcaster, social commentator, and has been engaged in the esoteric arts and healing since the mid-'80s. From 1994 to 2000, Robert was a telepsychic and tarot reader, being on the ground floor of the intuitive revolution, highlighted by the Uranus-Neptune conjunction from that period. In 2013 to 2014, he produced and appeared in 25 episodes of The 11th House on Gaia TV. He's a regular guest on many cutting-edge YouTube broadcasts. He's worked with thousands of people over the last 10 years. His methodology of teaching and breaking down astrological charts was in such demand that he created his own teaching series, the 16-hour video course. And that's with the 11th House Academy. Robert, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, thank you, Jimmy. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to our time that we're going to spend together over the next couple hours and just see where we can pilot this craft.
Absolutely. And there's so much to talk about. There's so much going on in the world. It seems like Pandora's box has completely been opened up and all hell is breaking loose. I'm not sure where you want to start, but do you want to speak a little bit about current events, maybe some stuff that's happening with the crazy Epstein story and Trump and a few things like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can drop into Epstein. I mean, it's where do we start with Epstein? I mean, I think the fascinating thing for me, and this maybe we'll bring some astrology stuff into this as well. But
yeah, for sure.
The fascinating thing about Epstein for me is that people who have been studying kind of what's going on behind the scenes have known about Epstein for the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, this is nothing new to any of us. I mean, we've been down that rabbit hole. We've, did we get the drone pictures from Rusty Shackelford? And no, they weren't there. But we knew about the island. We knew about Epstein. We knew about Ghislaine Maxwell. We knew about some of the girls. We had the people who were in Epstein's Black Book. I read Epstein's Black Book like 2 years ago on one of my shows. So it's very interesting that Epstein was circulating sort of beneath the surface of things for quite a while. And then all of a sudden, kind of out of the blue, they decide that they're going to reopen the case. The Miami Herald gets involved, and they basically pull him off the streets. And then there's this intense focus on Epstein. But again, we've been there for years now already. So it's kind of weird to see it get played out. And then the other thing that I think is really kind of an important thing to wrap our heads around is the sense that there's never any real completion with where we've been going with a lot of the kind of the uncovering or the peeling back the layers of so-called reality, dot connecting. There's a lot of great dot connecting. There's a lot of great decoding. There's a lot of great symbolism taking place, or at least decoding the symbolism. But at the end of the day, like, what's happening? Is there a denouement? Is there closure? And even with Epstein, supposedly when there's closure, there's no closure. Right. And to me, what it feels like, there's a number of different levels to the Epstein thing. Like, the extraction. I think he's still alive. I think he's getting reassigned. I think he's getting a new identity. I don't think he's dead. There's astrologically, there's some very interesting stuff around his death that says that is very shadowy, and there's a lot more to it than is on the surface. But again, it's kind of like we're getting this very weird, and this gets back to your Pandora's box. We're getting to this very weird place where all of a sudden there's like this kind of rush, and all these events are taking place, and it's almost like it's being like hurried, or like all these chips are getting pushed into the middle of the table very, very quickly. And what's happening is that people, because there's no kind of natural sort of beginning, a middle, and an end to this Epstein thing. I mean, it's as bizarre as when Lee Harvey Oswald got shot by Jack Rubenstein in Dallas. There's no organic kind of time scale with this thing. You know, he's in. It gets weird. You know, there's the thing that happens with his cellmate, and then boom, it's like he's gone. It's like a David Copperfield act, right? And it's leading to this sense of surreality, and because there's no kind of organic timeline around any of this thing. There's no organic time at all. It's all very fake. It's all very simulacra. It's all very simulated. And as a result, people are waking up even faster with this event, and they're beginning to see sort of the plastic nature of reality and the plastic nature of the script that is starting to unspool a bit here. I mean, I think we're coming to the end of the script. That's what it feels like to me. And
go ahead.
And as a result of that, I think that's when it gets interesting.
You know, it certainly seems like this is such a fake put-up situation. And I don't know if you follow George Webb at all, but George Webb is a real interesting journalist, and he's kind of in the middle of a lot of this stuff. I've been following it for many years, and he talks about the type of operation they do is a slap and seal. In other words, they take a patsy, they put him out there. He's either a semi-big fish or a big fish. And then they try and seal up the entire operation around the one guy who was just part of this gigantic operation that's worldwide and encompassing everything from running drugs for weapons to running uranium rods around the world, selling nuclear power plants to all these different, this is all connected together. And Epstein was a major player in there. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Epstein was also involved with Donald Barr, who was Bill Barr's father.
Right.
And so anybody who really thinks that Bill Barr is here to, put everything right and bring justice is not thinking correctly. And it's probably not common knowledge out there yet that those kind of connections out there. And it seems to me that Bill Barr was brought in as the AG to kind of put a lid on a lot of this stuff. He was heavily involved in some fairly nefarious stuff when he was AG for Daddy Bush.
Yeah, no, he had a really checkered past with Bush, and I was really surprised, to be honest with you, when he was named Attorney General. But apparently he's a cleaner. That's what he does, right? He comes in and he cleans stuff up. Yeah, I mean, what was his response to the whole Epstein thing? Well, he fires somebody who's head of some section of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. right. The guy who has nothing to do with what happened to Epstein, He just goes, okay, you're done. Somebody's got to take the fall for this, and it's not going to be me. And
it's so reminiscent of all of these operations that they cover up. The security cameras just happen to malfunction at exactly the right time. The security guards fell asleep. I mean, it's so incredibly ridiculous, the whole scenario. I'm just hoping that more people will see it for what it is, or at least question it, because these people have been getting away with this stuff for way, way, way too long. And, more of it is coming out, and that's encouraging. And I know you've covered a lot of it on your show, and I really enjoy watching that. And I'm really fascinated, though, too, with the astrological end of some of this. Could you jump into some of that, maybe some of Epstein stuff, or maybe just the USA in general, some of those astrological aspects?
Sure. the other thing I just wanted to bring up to your point about the slap and seal, Nexium was the same deal. Keith Raniere was the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
I think they got their pieces, their ducks all in a row with and I would love, and I know they're there, the connections between Nexium and Jeffrey Epstein. I know they're there. I know that they're entangled on some level. So let's talk a little bit about Epstein. First of all, he's an Aquarian. He was born on the first day of Aquarius, which makes him a 0-degree Aquarian. And the traits for the sun sign Aquarius are that they're basically, they're people-oriented, group-oriented. They tend to engage in the abstraction of thought, either science or metaphysics. They can be into things like computer software, programming, math, physics, and a lot of times they're kind of outside the box or outside the mainstream. And he was born on the first day of Aquarius, which means that the sun is at the sign is at its greatest potentiation during that 0 degree. So he's really Aquarian, right? He doesn't go to college. He's scooped up by Donald Barr, Bill Barr's dad, to teach at that prep school in New York City. It's kind of a very Aquarian thing to do, right? It's kind of
with no degree.
No degree. It's very Aquarian. So he must have been bright on some level. He must be bright on some level, right? Like I'm assuming he's probably like borderline Asperger's. That's what I think he is, and he's got some kind of unique traits. So he's an Aquarian. That's number one. And when you look at him, like I was really struck by when I watched that video of him and Donald Trump at Trump's place in Mar-a-Lago. You know the video where he's hanging out. I was watching Epstein. I'm looking at the guy, and I'm like, this guy's a goofball. He's just a goofball. He's eccentric. He's goofy. And when you read some of the descriptions of Epstein from some of the girls, that's how they describe him. He was nice. He was goofy. He was sweet. He was funny. And I think he got by on a lot of that kind of goofball charm. But he also has, today is really interesting. Today we have a Venus-Mars conjunction, which is pretty rare astrologically. So Mars and Venus hook up, roughly about once every 2 years. We've got a Venus-Mars conjunction because takes 2 years for Mars to go all the way around the zodiac. And so we had a Venus-Mars conjunction today in the sign of Virgo. Epstein was born with a Venus-Mars conjunction in the sign of Pisces, and it's a very unique kind of aspect in the sense that Venus represents the feminine side, and Mars is the masculine side. And when they come together in this kind of Piscean sandwich, it gets all messy because Pisces isn't about borders, it isn't about boundaries, and one of the traits or sort of hallmarks of the Venus-Mars conjunction can be various types of, how do I say this, unique sexual proclivities, like polyamory, bisexuality, and you can just kind of see that in Epstein's chart because with that Venus-Mars conjunction, he didn't really have any rules, because Pisces takes everything away, just wipes. So he was basically operating under the dictum of his own morality, and that was probably very mutable and changeable over the course of the arc of his experience. But it also, Venus-Mars gives the individual charisma, and the kind of charisma that, probably, cult leaders or group leaders can easily employ because they can both be at one time charming, disarming, relatable with Venus, but also have the ulterior motive with Mars pushing behind it. So he had that. He had that Venus-Mars conjunction. And right now we got a Venus-Mars conjunction in Virgo. It doesn't last very long. It lasts only a few days. But it'll be interesting to see what comes out on Monday when the news cycle hits again. Are we going to get some more Epstein material come Monday? Because these Venus-Mars aspects are in opposition with one another. So, just check your news feed tomorrow and see what pops up. It could be interesting. Now, as far as the death goes, I did a kind of a chart. So I didn't have Epstein's time of death. So I cast him a chart that I thought might have been kind of representative of who he is, with Capricorn on the midheaven, which actually turned out to be, I think, fairly correct in a lot of ways. But what I did have was the time that theoretically he died. So I cast a death chart, and then I put Epstein's chart over the top of that. and they were very interesting. And there was the suggestion of some foul play there, but the really telling kind of aspect was in that chart of the moment, that kind of horary snapshot of Epstein's death. Neptune was in Pisces in the 8th house, and the 8th house is the house of the underworld. And it is the house of death. And his Venus and Mars were conjunct that Neptune in the 8th house. So when I looked at that, I said to myself, there's something not right here, because we're not seeing the full story. We're seeing like the front story, and the front story does make some sense. Like I do think somebody died, okay? But I don't think it was Epstein. I think somebody did die. So we're seeing this mortality or this fatality, but you go around the other side of the chart, and Neptune is obscuring and obfuscating some bigger piece, some bigger picture. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And then I actually put Epstein's chart up against Donald Trump's chart, or let me see, no, it was Donald Trump's chart against the time that Epstein died. And from the ascendant perspective, they're almost the exact same charts. And Mars at that time was in Leo, and of course, Trump has Mars and Leo on his ascendant. So I can tell you right now, Donald Trump was involved in whatever happened to Jeffrey Epstein. Like his fingerprints astrologically are on that event. Now, whether it was to get him out and shake him down, or whether it was get him out because somebody in Israel told him to get him out, I don't know. But I can tell you right now, I know where that came from, and it came through Trump. And there's a lot of kind of sleight of hand, prestidigitation, which you can see in the 8th house. That's also a house of magic, by the way, the 8th house. And it was like low level magic. That's what was happening. It's just low level, grade C David Copperfield, sleight of hand magic. Now he's here, now he's not. That's cameras, guys. Now one of the guards won't cooperate. So it was a bad magic trick, but I would say basically, I believe he's alive, and based on the two charts, I believe it was Donald Trump that initiated whatever happened. Now, whether or not he was the one that was actually sort of the mastermind behind it, or somebody else was telling him to do it, that's a whole other story. But that came from Trump. Whatever happened, it came from Trump.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it was definitely a sloppy operation, because if you looked at that one photo that they gave us where they were wheeling him out, supposedly, the face didn't even match, wasn't even close, So
Right.
But for John Q. Public out there, Billy Bob Sixpack and Mary Jane Bonbons out there, that was him, he's dead. And that's the sad part, that so many people will just not question that, and it's frustrating, because we could put an end to all of this if we could just get that level of awareness up. And that's I sound like a broken record because I always say that every week, and but truly it's my heart intent to help the human family become free, and so we can create a much better world. We've got all these psychopaths and self-serving parasites running things, and we just can't let this stuff go on. Are you seeing astrologically, for the U.S. and maybe for the world in general, are you seeing some great epiphany or some occasion maybe that can give us hope in that direction?
Well, there's been some really interesting action at the Galactic Center, which is right around 27 tropical Sagittarius. And the Galactic Center is it's a fascinating idea. Okay, it's a fascinating idea, and it's a fascinating phenomenon, because theoretically the entire galaxy, right, whirls around this center point, which is located in tropical Sagittarius. And so in that galactic center, there's a black hole. And next to that black hole, there's a quasar. And there seems to be this really interesting relationship with this quasar that's kind of at the rim of this black hole. And so this quasar pulses and has this kind of reciprocal dance with this black hole. And then out of the black hole these neutrinos are emitted. And so we're getting over the last few weeks some very interesting action from the galactic center, which seems to me that the mind of God is inserting itself into the matrix at this point, so that there are waves of awakening, so that there are these moments where the veils get really thin and people have a greater degree of sensitivity and awareness. I do think that's occurring because it's a very unusual anomaly. The magnetosphere is off the charts. We've got solar flare activity coming. So the cosmic forces are starting to get engaged into this part of our game. Yeah, and I do, I don't want to sound pessimistic because I do see a much greater awareness than I ever did before. I remember back in the 90s thinking about a lot of these things because I was involved with a whistleblower newspaper in the 90s that we wrote about all this kind of stuff back then, and I thought it was completely hopeless, because it just seemed like nobody could understand or even want to understand. But now, 9/11 went a long way because in helping us in a roundabout way, because it was such a over-the-top, bizarre false flag, and enough people saw it for what it is and began to put out information about it, like the Loose Change movie and a bunch of others, that it did in fact boomerang back and create a lot more awareness that wasn't there before. And then when we saw the endless wars in the Middle East, so completely transparent, empire building, had nothing to do with what they said it did. And I think that made a lot of people question as well. And that is encouraging because, that's what we've got to do. And I always like to encourage people to share with their friends what they, their thoughts on these things. Not everybody has to agree, but we do have to, we don't have to agree on what's wrong exactly, but we do have to agree that we need to change things and we need to take our own power back. Because at this point, we've completely lost it, and the technology that's being pushed out in front of us is going to take that make that final blow against us, and we can't let that happen. So that's why we do what we do, Robert, and I know that's where your heart's at too. We're coming up on the break right here. You're listening to Inside the Matrix. Our guest today is Robert Phoenix. We'll be back in just a few minutes, so stick around with us. Also, check on the chat and feel free to call in if you want to. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Inside the Matrix, your ambassador to the unknown and host of Inside the Matrix, Jimi Brent.
Okay, welcome back once again to Inside the Matrix, where our guest today is Robert Phoenix. And where we left off, we were talking about the high strangeness surrounding the case of Jeffrey Epstein. So, Robert, you wanted to make another point along those lines? Yeah, Jimmy, I did. This goes back to that Venus-Mars conjunction where there's this real interesting symbiosis of theoretical opposites, right? Venus being feminine, Mars masculine, Venus being more receptive and relatable, Mars being more action-oriented, more will-based. So in Epstein's chart, they're really tight. They're like exactly conjunct. And one of the things that came out of this that I thought was very interesting, and I actually said that watch how Epstein is going to be an event that can galvanize both the left and the right around the same idea, which is that something is fishy in Denmark. Both the left and the right, like Rudy Giuliani was basically saying the same thing that the Young Turks were talking about, right? So the left and the right both came to the realization that this stinks. This isn't right. There's too many holes in this thing. And we, quote unquote, we need to get to the bottom of this. Well, good luck with that. But it was interesting that that's what happened. And it's kind of in his chart with that Venus-Mars conjunction. And it speaks to, in some ways, to some extent, the way out of this kind of deeply divided morass that we're in, is that if we have something together that we can focus on, or something together that has a shared interest or a shared value that both sides theoretically agree upon,
we can transcend a lot of this really deep, dark, and dangerous duality that they've been practicing on us for thousands of years. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
Sure, and that's really interesting. And I tend to agree with you that I think Epstein is in fact still alive, and it's hard to imagine, unless he really pissed somebody off, that they would just take him out like that. But definitely they wanted to close the case, so that's a convenient way of doing it. Oh, he just committed suicide. He hung himself with toilet paper.
Yeah, I mean, what is the guy gonna hang himself with? There's nothing in that cell.
Oh, I know. And how, yeah, it's just so absurd, so completely absurd. And but that's their method of wrapping things up, is like you mentioned before, the Lee Harvey Oswald, it's always the lone gunman or the lone bomber or the lone guy, the patsy that they put out there, whether it's the Oklahoma City thing or, there's always the one patsy. Same with all these false flag shooting events. They get some young crazed guy that they probably mind controlled and is on psychotropic drugs. And although like this last one, people talked about in that Walmart, there was 3 or 4 shooters.
That's right.
But, that immediately disappeared from, or anybody's news or any interviews that they did with live witnesses who were there. And so, that seems to be their standard operating procedure, where they have to have one fall guy, and it's just easier for the public to concentrate and get mad at one
it's getting
central
tired.
character.
It's getting tired, though. It's getting really, really tired. Like I said,
Yeah.
So I have a question for you, right? So you're a terrestrial radio guy. You've got a talk show, and you're following the game, right? You're keeping score. I listen to talk radio, and I listen to these bozos on talk radio, and not once have I ever heard anybody on quote unquote mainstream conservative talk radio bring up the fact that there were people who said that there were multiple shooters at the Walmart in El Paso. Not one.
Nope.
And I'm like, this is the real crime and failure. We talk about the fake news on TV and CNN and MSNBC, where you've got a whole network of conservative talk radio out there that just does not go anywhere near where the smoking gun is. Doesn't that piss you off on some level, being a terrestrial talk guy?
Absolutely. It's extremely frustrating because, on some levels you can agree with them, but they're supposedly opposing this globalist, capital communist agenda that, seems to be the plan, goes right in hand with the technology and the transhumanist agenda and all that. Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, whatever that happens to be. We can see that that's the push. And whether or not, Trump was inserted into this for another purpose, it's, to me, the jury's still out, because there are a lot of things that I like about Trump, because it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing almost.
Right.
But then again, a lot of things he does are very disturbing, like his alliances with Israel, which you have to think Rothschild when you think Israel. But Getting back to your point, the conservative talk show hosts out there, again, they're still dealing on a very political level. It's a very partisan political level.
I would agree with you. They're locked into that partisan game. They've got their sort of parameters. They've got their box. They've got to stay in their box. But at the same time, they're doing us an incredible disservice. Even if they are operating within an unlimited bandwidth, they're doing us an incredible disservice by not approaching the subject matter in an intelligent way, even if it's just once or twice, so that their listeners can begin to think about it and talk about it. That's just my 2 cents.
I agree totally. And I think that, they are functioning as part of the agenda in some way. I really don't like to say that, because it almost makes it sound hopeless, because If they're not on our side, and obviously the other socialist, communist, globalists aren't on our side, who is? That's always the question. Are there actually white hats out there? Are there actually those guys in the military, possibly the CIA, NSA, DIA, that are really trying to do the right thing? And to me, I don't know. I hope so. I deeply, deeply hope so, because if not, we're in a world of trouble. And speaking about Trump before a little while ago, I want to make the point that, when people talk about Israel's such a charged subject because it's all intertwined with Jewish people. And the Jewish people, for the most part, they're just as much out of the picture as we are as far as actually being involved in play. It's their leadership, just like ours. And when you think of Israel, you have to think of the Rothschilds, because they're the ones who helped create Israel along with the U.S. and Great Britain. And they made that happen. And so part of me thinks that what's going on here is two world factions are having it out. The Rothschilds against whatever else is on the other side with the Clinton, Soros, that whole agenda, globalist agenda types. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my feeling is that the world governmental body is composed of gangs, really high-level gangs with suits and ties and accreditation. And these gangs are basically known by their affiliations with other people. Like, clearly, the Clintons and the Bush are part of a crime syndicate. They're a crime syndicate. Yeah. That's what they are. So they're a gang. I believe Trump and the Trump family operation is another variation of a gang. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. And then we have the gang in Israel, which ironically was started by the Irgun gang. It's another gang. These are all like really, really high level gangs.
And then the Stern gang.
The Stern gang and yeah. I mean, gangs tend to have these occasional turf wars, right? And they basically want to kind of work together if they can, because their worlds get really complicated when they eat each other. But I do think what we're seeing is some high level redistribution of the hierarchy inside of this kind of collective that's taking place. And we're kind of watching to some degree these sort of these extant gang wars going on at times. And I also think that, like, Rothschild, I don't think Rothschild cares whether or not, or the Rothschild family cares whether or not that we roll into some kind of Bolshevik China social democracy, or whether we roll into some kind of state-sponsored nationalist global network. I don't think they care. They've shown through their history that they'll basically put money on both candidates. Whoever wins becomes. So I don't really think that the Rothschilds care per se, but I do think that they care about their assets and who's going after their assets, how their assets are being used, squandered, mismanaged, or misrepresented. Now, one thing I read, and I'm not sure this is true, but I've heard that the Rothschilds are actually pissed off at Donald Trump because he's not representing their asset base in a responsible fashion. So there could be some fracturing even between theoretically Trump and the Rothschilds, even though the Rothschilds seem to have been very, very instrumental in the lives and the careers of many of Trump's people, including Wilbur Ross, right? Yep. So I think it's a really interesting, complex game, and I think we're seeing kind of a reshuffling. I do think there are white hats. I'm not sure if there are a lot of them. I mean, anytime you get into, I was using this analogy the other day, but like when you're in high school, there are all these cliques, right? There are all these cliques in high school, all these different groups. So your high school was one group, and then within that group, there were groups within that group. So if you look at something like the CIA, there are groups within the CIA, and I know this for a fact because I talked with Jay Widener one day, and Jay told me some interesting stories, or an interesting story about a conversation he had about someone who was inside, basically said, "We like you, there are other people here that don't like you. So when I heard that, it confirmed sort of my point of view is that these organizations or these agencies, even though they may be monolithic, there are small breakaway factions inside of these organizations or these agencies. Now, whether or not they can, amass enough momentum in order to make some serious change, well, that's a whole other story. So I do think the white hats are out there. I'm not sure where they are in number. I'm not sure if they're always coordinated. But when we get into Trump, I think Trump's a really interesting historical character, and we can talk about the enigma of Donald Trump when we get there.
Okay. Well, let's take a few minutes in it. Let's go back and share with us your journey. How did you get to the mindset you're at now, and how did you become awake and aware of what's going on in the world?
So when I was a kid, I was a really different kind of kid, and I was kind of like born an outsider, and not into any terrible circumstances or anything. I was born an outsider. I always had this feeling that I was kind of on the outside looking in, although a participant. So I developed kind of unusual ideas as a child, like 6, 7, 8 years old. And, I continued to sort of just do what other kids do, play baseball, read comic books, stuff like that, right? But I was into like multidimensionality and time travel,
Wow.
when I was a little kid. I mean, I was thinking about it, it's like I was trying to understand these things on some level, past, future, other dimensions. So as I got older, of course, I got into more sort of, adolescent stuff, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that whole thing.
The usual.
Yeah. It was the 1970s. But again, I was an outsider. I was always an outsider. I listened to music that other people just were not dialed into. And I'm not just saying this because, I'm just trying to glorify my past. It's just who I was. And, people said, what are you listening to? It's called reggae, man. It's called reggae music. And they were like, oh, what's that? And I'd play in that. And that eventually evolved to me kind of always trying to find the edge, right? Like, where's the edge?
Right.
And so, through my sort of psychedelic journeys, a number of other kinds of trips, right? It eventually led me to a place where I went really right over the edge, and I had a real dark night of the soul. And it happened when I was 20 years old in San Francisco. And as a result of this dark night of the soul, I'll skip the dirty details, but as a result of it, I had a conversion experience. And it was around 20, 21, and I had been given this book by this guy who was giving me all this kind of esoteric information when I was like 19 years old. And it was like I was reading it, and I was trying my best to understand it. It was very interesting. But then he hands me this book one day called My Peace by the Lord himself. Right? I'm like, well, this is a little heavy for my reading habits right now. So I put it up. I put it up on my shelf. But after I had this dark night of the soul weekend, I pulled it off and I started to read this thing, and an amazing change began to take place inside of me. It was almost like I was reading the words right off of my soul. And then I had this really profound kind of metaphysical shift in my life. I started to have out-of-body experiences. I started to see auras. I started to have telepathic experiences, synchronicities up the wazoo. It was a really, really interesting time. And so I got very deeply involved in mysticism, seven ray stuff. That was kind of a big deal for me. Eventually wound up going to Findhorn, did a lot of the alternative community. So I was a really, really hardcore seeker. Like that was a big, big part of me. But I always had like another foot into sort of into the dark world. And along that journey, I started to learn like esoteric systems. And I started to learn numerology and tarot and astrology and the runes. And it was just really easy. It just came to me like that. Like, so it's like checking into something that was already there. And then I began to have the real kind of the deep red pill moment. Because I was already kind of verging in that direction. But the deep red pill moment for me was the first Gulf War. And that was in 1990. And I was living in Olympia, Washington at the time. And things were just happening. Like I was exploding on the inside in a really, really kind of an amazing, we know that feeling, right? We know that feeling when all of a sudden the veil gets ripped away and you're like, holy shit, this is great. I feel like I'm touching into something. That's what was happening to me in 1990. And right when that happened, the Gulf War was taking place, and I used to work at this restaurant, and I was in the kitchen during the morning shift, and I was listening to the radio. I heard this really interesting guy on the radio. I'm like, holy shit, this guy is really getting this thing. Who is this guy? And I listened to the radio. His name is Bill Cooper.
Yeah.
So Bill Cooper was coming to Evergreen College that weekend. He was on the local radio, AM radio station. So I'm like, I'm there. So I was there in 1990. I got one of the first copies of Behold a Pale Horse.
Great book.
And after that, I was, it's been a part of my life, every single day. And, of course, there were moments like 9/11, but there are other things happening too, like big stuff that in some ways it didn't grab the headlines, at least for me. And then during the 90s, I went through another awakening, and it was really interesting because in the 80s, it was very light. It was very light. And in the 90s, I went through a dark awakening, and that was very powerful in a lot of ways. I went through, what I would call an endarkenment. And it was not an easy time for me because, I stepped over the line, and I'm actually really, really lucky to be here. And so I learned a lot about kind of dark energy and dark power and kind of I had Pluto on my ascendant. And I was really drawn to, what was really going on behind the scenes in a deep, dark sort of way. And that's when I put together a lot of the, sort of the really, really deep occult underground stuff. But I've just been working with it, pretty much since the 90s. But most of my life, I've been gravitating, along this wavelength.
Well, that's super interesting, and I'm sure you've heard Mark Passio speak about his past, and a lot of us have studied, occult, which simply means hidden type things, and even dark magic, things like that, and it's what's important about it is that's what's running this world. The people that run this world, that's what they're using. So if you want to understand what's happening and you want to think about possible solutions, you've got to know what's happening in the world. A lot of people are afraid to look at that. They don't want to look at it. It's very disturbing. I agree. It's super disturbing to look at a lot of that stuff, but we have to be able to understand what's going on in our world if we're going to do anything about it. And occasionally people write to me and say, oh, I don't want to hear all this gloom and doom stuff, And all I can say to that is, yeah, I don't either. So let's do something about it. Let's see what we can do. Let's create enough awareness so that we don't have to deal with the doom and gloom, and we can do something better in the world. And so you have to look at both sides. You have to be aware that there is a dark side to the world. There's a dark side to each of us individually as well. Yeah. And so we have to be aware of these things. And it's part of the consciousness expanding path that many of us are on. I mean, we want to keep growing. We want to keep learning. And I'm sure you're like me. You're like a sponge. You're always interested in learning new things and studying different aspects of our world and beyond. And I must ask you, we've only got a couple of minutes here, but do you think there are other races, other beings behind a lot of the political activity that we're seeing? You have any thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, it certainly feels like it. The alien thing is always an interesting, sort of tricky slope, right? I mean, right. So I think there's a lot of interdimensionality with the alien stuff. I've actually I've had that contact on an interdimensional level. One time, it was when I was going through an Ibogaine journey, right, back in the 90s, and so that I've experienced that, and that to me is very, very real. As far as the reptilian stuff and the Zeta stuff, I think it's quite possible. And if you want, we could talk more about that when we come back from that break.
Yeah, for sure. I always have that feeling, and I've had my own experiences with that as well. But I always feel like there's more behind the scenes, because the continuity of the plan goes far beyond the normal lifespan of most humans. So it just, it's been going on for thousands of years. And really the only thing that's changed in all of that is the technology that we use. And the technology that we have just enables, the dark side to accelerate their program. And again, it's a double-edged sword, because it also enables us to analyze their program, talk about it, and create that awareness so that possibly we can do something about it. We need to free the human family, as they say. So we're coming up on the break. You're listening to Inside the Matrix with our guest, Robert Phoenix. We've got a lot more interesting things to talk about. Catch us in the chat. Give us a call if you want to. We'll be right back in just a few minutes. All right, welcome to Inside the Matrix with our guest, Robert Phoenix. And we're going down some interesting rabbit holes today. Robert was sharing with us his story on kind of his journey and how he got to where he's at today. And we were just talking on the break about AI and their possible role in what's happening in the world and steering political events, world events, maybe managing our societies and culture. Robert?
Yeah, so, I think that inevitably we're going to have to cross that Rubicon with AI or artificial intelligence, self-recognition systems, right? This is all being planned out, has been planned out for a very, very long time. So really interesting development that took place this last week, and I'll bet you're aware of this, is that there was a business roundtable where 188 of the world's most powerful corporations all came together and basically agreed on how they're going to rule the world together. Okay.
Yeah.
That happened, and that is really significant, because now they're going to put the plan into place. And the plan that they want to put into place basically is to, how do I put this in really compassionate or empathic terms? Basically, they want to decimate the middle class. They want to decimate sort of the historical contribution and historical tethering of the Caucasian Northern European. This is a big part of the plan, and if you can't see it, you don't want to admit, you don't want to look at it, you're going to be in for a very rude awakening, because it's already happening in Europe. Right, this has been a big action plan for them since around 2012, 2013, when the first push of the migrants started to happen, right when Neptune went into Pisces. And this idea that people were, they were victims, or they were displaced, or they were refugees, it really played into that Neptune and Pisces kind of mindset and experience. It still has to this day, right? But they're doing essentially the same thing here in the United States. Although in the United States, there's a whole different level of propaganda, because we're going to talk about Trump, but for 2 years they tried to tie Trump to Russia, and ultimately it didn't work. And before that match could, that coal could stop burning, they were on to creating this scenario where Trump is basically a grand wizard dragon of the KKK, and that every white person in America is a closet, grand wizard dragon of the KKK. And we're emissaries, right? We work for Trump because of our skin tone. And just like we see these messages go across Sinclair Media, and all these stations are parroting the same opening and closing lines during the 6 o'clock news, this broadcast has been sent out vis-a-vis the left, and it's a very, very dangerous form of propaganda. It's an endgame propaganda, because what they want to do is they want to essentially turn the United States into the next version of South Africa, which I think is really, really irresponsible. And there are deep repercussions for that kind of social engineering. And people need to be aware of this. And I've tried to bring this to the attention of everybody, and not just so-called white people, that, we're being played, and we're being just hammered right down the middle. And whoever's left over and if the quote unquote controllers, the elite, are left over, well, they'll just have their AI and they'll just kind of run the planet, and whoever's left over gets to, fight that battle. So we may as well, try to pull together if we can. So this is a reality. It's happening. But what these 188 corporations have basically agreed upon is that we're going to make diversity. We're going to make diversity a real priority. Diversity has nothing to do with meritocracy. If you're good, you're good. It doesn't matter what skin color you are. Doesn't matter what religion you are, right? But that's not how diversity works. Diversity says we will hire people in spite of the fact that they may not be qualified, but they fit a particular profile within our corporate structure. So that was like item 1A on their checklist. And then they got into all this putting, people before profit. When was the last time a corporation put people before profit? Come on.
Never.
And one of the other action items is we're going to be concerned about the environment. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? What it means is code for climate change and carbon taxing, right? So
taxes, that's it.
Yeah,
taxes.
They are assembling their forces right now on a corporate level. This gets into astrology. We were in a Pluto and Capricorn phase, and Pluto and Capricorn is a big deal. Capricorn represents our hierarchies. It represents corporations. It represents governments. It represents, like, it's ruled by Saturn, right? And Saturn has these really intense kinds of, overtones of, being dark, and at times, kind of related to the underworld and Baphomet, and it's the hypercube, it's the black sun. So we got Pluto in Capricorn right now. And it came in 2009, and right on cue, what happens in 2009? We have the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, right? That's what happens.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Well, what happens after that is that the United States government begins to buy up corporations, buy up GM, and they buy up Bear Stearns, and they're running Solyndra. And so that was the first kind of iteration of Pluto and Capricorn. And when governments and business combine forces, it's the definition of fascism, right?
Yeah.
That's what fascism is.
Yeah.
So now what we're looking at, Saturn in Capricorn, Pluto in Capricorn, haven't seen this aspect since, God, we got to go back to the Reformation and Martin Luther. It's the last time we had this aspect going on.
Wow.
It's a very big deal, really, really big deal. So they're pushing all in because they want to have their corporatocracy and their corporate control, which leads us into the dark age of Aquarius, because they're the ones that are going to be running the smart cities programs, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. These are going to be the UN-approved corporations. And in that scenario, that's another timeline, right? That is a very, very dark scenario in which most people live in kind of a feudal technocracy. And it is deeply, deeply surveilled, 24/7. It's right out of a Philip K. Dick novel. He time traveled. He went there. He saw it. He knew what it was all about. And on one timeline, that's where we're headed. That is the dark Aquarian age. Now, people ask me, well, what can I do against it? They've got all these, all this technology, and, they've got this plan in place, and they've got all this media. Well, look, you got to start with the most simple answer to that question. You start with yourself. That is the most simple point of entry to this oncoming crisis. The first thing that a person has to do is that they've got to be right with their body. You've got to be right with your health. You've got to be fit. You can't be dealing with lingering illnesses. And I know there's a lot of weird space age shit out there, but you got to tackle it. And you've got to get strong, and you've got to get flexible, and you have to have endurance, and you got to eat the right food. And once you get the vehicle tuned up, then you can start to work with other people. And that's where we're going to be our most empowering, is on a one-to-one level, right? Like right here, what we're doing right now, Jimmy, this is really important stuff. And it may seem like we're just doing a show on a Sunday afternoon, right? And for some people, it's filling time or background noise. But every time we do this, we get a little stronger. We build our immunity. We build our immunity on an individual level. We build it on a collective level. And it's really important. And then you got to figure out what can you do locally? How can you make your world a little bit better? Here in Fredericksburg in Texas, we're working on taking the fluoride out of the water. So we got an initiative on the ballot for November, and we're very, very small, but we're very dedicated. And based on the work of the guys that wrote The Fourth Turning, this is where it's at. It's not out there in the macro. It's right here within each and every one of us, taking care of ourselves, and honoring, and I'm going to use the G word, honoring God within, right? The cosmic Christ. It's in each and every one of us. This is the true signal of the universe. And this trumps AI every single time. These guys have been trying their absolute best to reorder the entire genome of the planet, right? To reorder the rocks and the plants and the water and the animals, because they've been throwing down these nanobots and all of these these foreign agents, but overriding our food, genetically modified organisms, right? They want to take us off this analog that we were blessed with, which has been the seed of our awakening, the seed of our life force. Yes. And when they do what they're trying to do, and I'm gonna broach some kind of an idea here that maybe some people are not comfortable with, but they are trying to overwrite Christ. Okay, they are trying to overwrite the Christ consciousness, which pervades everything. Yep. Right, it's in everything. So you've got it in you, Jimmy, Tina Marie, my cat. We've all got this. And when we understand that, and when we are clear, we get a lot of the bullshit out of our systems, including toxic relationships and people that are not willing to listen to you and take you seriously. Don't waste time on people who shut you down or shoot you down. Move on, okay? It's the best thing you can do. If somebody has a modicum of awareness and they show some respect and they want to have a conversation, sit down and talk to those people. But we got to build our immunity up, and then we have to take care of one another and be really, really conscious all the time of what's going on inside of ourselves, how we treat other people, because this matters. It matters, right? When we are conscious and we can have conscious interactivity, what we're doing is we're building up, this idea of the noosphere. And the noosphere is this bandwidth of consciousness that responds to us in kind of a respiratory fashion. So we've got to bank. We have to bank our spirit, right? We have to bank our spirit with one another. We have to bank our spirit with this consciousness that is really willing to help us and is willing to be there for us. And when it works, look, on this float thing, I'm working with people that are hardcore Catholics. Okay, they say, "Bless you, brother," and God's got a plan for us. I don't care. That's great. Yeah. Count me in. Okay, count me in. I may not go to church with you. I may not, eat the bread and drink the wine, but I'm all in on that vibe. And that's where we can take this thing. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to, because if we don't have it, we don't stand a chance.
I couldn't agree more, and you put that so well. I really agree with everything you said there. It makes so much sense. And what we're doing here and what people do when they engage in these conversations that are uplifting, the collective consciousness is what steers events in this world. And so that's why the elite spend so much time and energy trying to steer what we're thinking about and how we're thinking it. And they want us to think along their lines. They want us to think about their wars and their agendas, and not for us to think about ours. Well, it's time for us to stand up as human beings, as spiritual beings with the Christ consciousness within us, and stand up for ourselves and for what we know is right and true. And that benefits everybody. The elite's agenda is their agenda. It benefits only them. It's very self-serving, and it's parasitic. And we've seen that forever and ever. But we're reaching the time where we've got to turn that around. We've got to change it. We have to take a stand and do something about it. And I'm so glad to hear that you're doing something around the fluoride in your city. And that's a good place to start for a lot of people, because there's evidence. There's even Harvard studies that prove that the fluoride they put in water is a neurotoxin, and it's carcinogenic and it causes cancer. And that's easily provable now, whereas we didn't have access to that kind of information before. And that's one of the things that's really helping us so much of having the internet. Although the elite are using it for their information gathering and their social engineering, we're using it too to communicate with people that we never had the ability to communicate with before on a massive scale. And we're going to keep that up in spite of the censorship that's going on. So my feeling is that as they crack down on YouTube and other things like that, we're going to find that other venues and other platforms will pop up that we can use. So we have to keep that in mind. But until then, we'll use what they give us, whatever we have to work with, to get important information out to people so that they can make up their own minds about things. But we have to create the awareness that freedom is got to be uppermost in our minds. Freedom for everyone. Equality for everyone, opportunity for everyone, cooperation, all of these things are super important. And I think in the hearts and minds of most people, that's really where they're at if they really think about it. If they get away from their daily grind long enough, most people are there. They're just not expressing it because they're having to survive. Right. In this world, most people's energy is spent on daily survival, taking care of their family, going to work, making money, pay the rent. But your point is very well taken about the physical side of it too. We have to take care of ourselves. Yeah. Eat as much organic food as we can, get as pure water as you can, because the healthier you are, the stronger you are in every way. The stronger your aura is, the stronger your psychic ability and everything else. It all kind of goes hand in hand. So it behooves all of us to, try our best to keep in shape, take care of ourselves, exercise, eat the right kind of foods, because there's plenty of crap out there to indulge in, right?
Oh, for sure. And some of it is, really, really good and tasty, and it makes you want to come back for more. No, you're totally right, and I think if we could just sort of how do I say this? Kind of recenter our awareness in our physical bodies and begin to eliminate the things that are really draining us and causing us to be ill. It's a really, really good start. You have more energy, and you can look around and say, well, geez, we could really save some money here if maybe there were about 4 or 5 people in our neighborhood that we could buy bulk with. And it's like, now all of a sudden you're creating a community experience. You got 4 or 5 people, you're sharing the cost across a number of bulk items, and you're maybe cutting your food bill in by a quarter, right? And all it takes is just that little extra effort to get out of kind of the pattern or the hamster wheel to think that there's something else that you can do. Or maybe there's a community garden that 3 or 4 of you can work on together and start to grow some food. I mean, these are small things, but they're in the grand scheme of things, it's very, very important. And we're turning. What I love about this time, Jimmy, is that there are some interesting cycles coming to an end, and some new cycles that are beginning and being reanimated in very interesting ways, like being conservative or having fundamental values around family and children and having a home and those kinds of real important feelings or important pieces in our lives that feed us for generations. That's coming back. And guess what? It's radical. That's like radical. Like if you want to be a punk rocker, you want to be radical, well, get married, have some kids, but be conscious about it. Just don't do it because the script is there. That's the most radical thing you can do. Right. And the other thing, too, that's really, really interesting, because we're coming back into a reassemblage of what that means, and in a more conscious and enlightened sort of way. The other thing is we went through the New Age period where there were some interesting things, some good things, some not so interesting things, some Pied Piper material. Right. So that was happening. Right. And then for me, I started to go through that was my darkenment. But I was hanging out in Marin County with these people, and I was like, you guys are losing the plot here, because there's a lot of shit that you're not owning, and there's a lot of shit that's happening you're not aware of. And so as a result, because I was there, and then eventually the whole kind of awakening the red pilling, that's taken place. And that's a lot of like kind of, right brain stuff, left brain stuff. It's all kind of logical and pattern orientation. So what we need to do and where we need to go ultimately is to bring some of those kind of interesting things from the new age, where, we understand the power of intention. We understand, archetypes. We understand the shadow. We understand energy. And we marry that to this awareness that we've accrued over, say, the last 6 or 7 years. And now we have a new model. There's a new model that we can begin to incorporate, which is more of a quantum model. And then our discussions on YouTube become different. We're talking about different things. And YouTube is running around trying to find ways to ban people that aren't talking about things in the way that they used to, in a way that's much more empowering, much more high level, and yet doesn't sacrifice the truth. Because that's where we're headed. And when that happens, now we're cooking with gas. And it gets me back to my favorite poet, philosopher, painter of all time, William Blake, the 18th century poet who had the model of innocence, experience, and imagination. And our job, our duty, is to move from experience into imagination.
Well, imagination, that's the key that unlocks all the creativity and the direction that we need to go, and remedies, solving problems, that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thinking processes that we need to indulge in, and thinking of better ways to do things. Doing more things locally, as you pointed out, makes a lot of sense. There's a really cool indoor growing facility here in Las Vegas, which I recently found out about, and I want to get over there and check it out. It's completely organic. It's all indoors in a huge warehouse. They have, the grow lights and everything in there, and they're growing just wonderful produce and things like that. And a lot of the local restaurants are buying from them.
In this country, we have a history of being innovators. We're innovators and we're inventors and we're early adopters. And that's part of the spirit of this country. And I think it's a really vital component of this country. And we need to foster that and nurture that. And if Trump has any kind of really deep insight, he'd be on the same page too.
Well, I sure he does have some insight. And I hope that, this is not just another rabbit hole to go down, thinking that Trump is going to be our next savior, because I definitely don't think he is. But he certainly is in a position to do a lot of great things for humanity if he decides to do that. And as far as I'm concerned, the jury's still out on that. But I'm very hopeful that maybe he will go in that direction. And, we'll see. We'll just have to wait and see. Again, we're coming up against the break. You're listening to Inside the Matrix. Today, we're with Robert Phoenix. We'll be right back.
Okay, welcome back to Inside the Matrix with our guest, Robert Phoenix. Robert, let's talk about what's coming up in the next couple months. Astrologically, what do you see? I was told before, a few months ago, I remember talking to an astrologer, and she said that looking at Trump's chart, she saw that around mid-September that he was actually going to really start coming into his own, and that he was in actually danger up to that point because of, and I don't really claim to understand any of this, but that's your end. But that was the point that she made, that if he made it to mid-September, that he would be able to do a lot of things that he wants to do. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so what she's referring to is Donald Trump is a Leo rising, and he has his Mars at 28 degrees Leo rising. So we've just gone through a period when Mars has gone through his 12th house, and that is an aspect of hidden enemies, right? Hidden enemies. So now, what's really interesting is that when Mars went through his 6th house in the sign of Aquarius, he had open enemies during that time. And the most obvious open enemy, believe it or not, was Omarosa, who also happens to be in Aquarius, and she wrote that tell-all book about Trump. And so that was, we could see Mars in action. Like he knew what he was up against, and whether it was him or Scaramucci, or whoever he had to deal with, they were on the playing field. With Mars in the 12th house, it's behind the scenes. And this was really a very critical phase for Donald Trump, because he has Pluto in the sign of Leo. So he actually had a Mars-Pluto conjunction that was going through his 12th house. And that could result in violence. It could result in very deep subterfuge. It could result in loss of fortune, resources, money, ultimately perhaps even death. And so I was watching that transit. It was a very big transit. And then he had to get through this Mars transit of the 12th house. Mars is right now at 3 degrees in Virgo, so it's cleared his ascendant. He had his Mars return. His Mars return, by the way, is very synonymous and synced up with Epstein and the disappearance ultimately of Epstein, which is why I believe he had something to do with it, right? So he's got Mars in his first house now in Virgo, which is a sign that is about service. It's about, helping others. It's related to health. So it's going to be very interesting. Now, Mars in the first house is also a very vital aspect. So I was watching a press conference with Trump, recent one, and he was on fire. I mean, the guy was totally on fire. And he had some bozo from NBC who just kept shouting him down and, doing the typical, kind of agitprop sort of stratagem. Right. And Trump eventually just called him out on it. He called him out on it, and he just undressed the guy. And I am totally with you on the Israel thing. I'm not. Here's the deal, right? Countries take over countries all the fucking time. So Israel took over that part of the world. That happens. Russia took over a bunch of countries on their march to Berlin, and they never gave them back. Okay. My issue is what's happened since then, and how they treat the Palestinians, and how they basically become infested in our government through AIPAC and right. the dual citizenry of the people that are serving inside of our government. I've got an issue with that. The whole, taking over and mandate Palestine and all that stuff. This is the way of the world. That shit happens. Do I think it was cool? No, I don't. But I'm a pragmatist. For me, it's what's happened after the fact. I don't, but what's going on with him in Israel? Is he playing Israel? I mean, is he doing some 5D chess? Is it really just kind of, buttering up his ego because right. he's on a coin and, and they're naming stuff after him? I mean, I don't know. And that is the enigma of Trump that is fascinating, right? But I will say this, and I'll get into the enigma piece. I really appreciated what he did to that bozo reporter. And when Trump was running for president, I would tell people, I said, look, this is good. He may not be good, but this is good. And the reason why it's good is because he's blowing up political correctness. He's blowing up what's going on with the media. It's up to us to take the energy and run with it, right? This is liberating shit. I mean, yeah. He's got a Sun Uranus conjunction in Gemini. So he is a radical. Trump's a radical. He is a maverick, right? And the weird thing about him is sometimes he'll do something and I'll scratch my head. Why are you doing that? Who are you trying to appease? Is it Ivanka? Is it Jared? And they don't come around. He'll do something like, that was really great. But I think that's part of who Trump is. That's that Gemini thing. I'm a globalist. I'm a nationalist. I mean, he'll do that. And that's part of his madness. It's part of his chaos. It's part of his method. It's part of his magic. And I think it is too soon. We're too close. We're too close to draw any real conclusions about where this is all going. We're just too close with it. So I am in the suspension of disbelief. I know what I like. I know what I don't like. And I think that he has gone through things that other people and that would have made other people completely wilt and crumble. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. The 2 years that he had to deal with all this Russia jive, Not once did you ever see him get ruffled, yell at somebody, scream at somebody. He was always on point. He was always on track with his message. It may have been a crazy message, but Trump is a very interesting character. And I believe he's a very pivotal character that bridges us between the end of the 20th century and wherever it is that we're going to be going when Pluto goes into Aquarius, Uranus is in Gemini, Saturn is in Aries, Neptune's in Aries. That's a really wild time ahead. He is the bridge. And, that period after Saturn goes from Aquarius into Pisces is a very pivotal time, because that's an aspect that shows up when socialism rears its ugly head. So we're going to have to stare that down. And if that's in the wind, and if it's in the stars, then we better find a better alternative than what's being cooked up, which is incredibly divisive and disempowering. Getting back to the aspects of this year, in November, Jupiter is going to hit, at the end of November, beginning of December, Jupiter is going to start to hit the outer degrees of Sagittarius, which means it's going to start to conjunct the galactic center. I think later November and early December are going to be a really important and very powerful time. And if you could use, or I could use, a sailing analogy, in your own life, you want to go wing on wing in whatever you're doing. You want to breathe in as much inspiration as possible, and you want to ground the belief that things are possible in your life, whether it's breaking a bad habit, ending a bad relationship, creating an invention, whatever it is, that is going to be really high-level pneuma during that period of time. So grab it, bring it in, because you're going to need it for the year ahead. After that, we get into a massive stellium and conjunction of planets in Capricorn. We're going to have a solar eclipse in Capricorn. It starts on Christmas night, and then moves into the day following Christmas, so the 25th and the 26th. It is, in my estimation, the potential to be a very dark Christmas, which, Christmas has its own kind of dark connotations anyway. Right. But so you want to get all that Jupiter Sagittarian, Sun and Sagittarian energy coming in November, early December, because you want to get through this period. Now, I see the beginning of the end of December, and then the big conjunction between Saturn and Pluto, which happens on January 12th. Those two events are linked, and I believe that they're financial, and I believe that they're related to some kind of reset. Now, I don't think the economy is going to crash, but because we're in a Uranus and Taurus cycle, money's going to change. I was on a show today with a good friend, Marina Darkstar, who's a great astrologer over in England, and she pointed out that one of the last times that Uranus was in Taurus, it was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Saturn-Pluto conjunction. That was when the gold ducat was adopted as a currency of trade. So Uranus tends to be technological, and it tends to be scientific, and Taurus tends to be material. So my sense is, and you can see this already being ramped up, you can see it in commercials, that they want to get people using their phones to have financial transactions as much as possible. And that is going to be the big push for 2020, and I believe that there's going to be this kind of shell game that's going to be going on. If you've noticed that there are these companies like Rakuten and Doge, there are others, and what they do, Rakuten provides you with like cash back and discounts, and so you go through their app, you use the app, and you get like a break on stuff. It's kind of like a meta coupon sort of business model. And my sense is that we're going to see an acceleration in the cost of goods and the cost of food, which is going to artificially devalue the dollar. Your dollar will just get less. It'll buy less. However, if you use your phone and you have some of these apps like Rakuten and some of these other models that are incentivizing you to use them while you shop, you'll recoup some of those losses because of the cost of goods going up, and thus the devaluation of the dollar. That's my prediction for 2020. We're going to see a big push for digital currency, and the cell phone is going to be the portal. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm not sure everybody's going to want to bite on it, but something's going to take place between December and January. Eclipse cycles last 6 months, and there's going to be this reordering and reshuffling.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I see that too. And I think that the whole Bitcoin, all those different other coins that came out afterwards were just sort of used to the idea of using that digital currency, which is very dangerous because while convenient, it also gives somebody else the opportunity to shut your account down if they don't like what you're saying or doing. And there's not much you can do about it. If they do away with cash completely, which I hope never happens, then we're pretty much screwed, because if you're not politically correct, they'll find a reason to all of a sudden disappear your account. Then what are you going to do? And we're seeing, to me, I think in China is you mentioned other models too, but in China, I think that is one of the models that they're considering bringing over here. They already have the social credit score and all that software in place, the facial recognition software, and that's a whole complete control system in and of itself.
Right.
And bringing that to this country would be absolutely devastating. And I think that, I don't know, there's the boiling frog thing. So if you do it slow enough, maybe it'll work. But I think we're going to, if they try and push that too quickly, I think that people are going to stand up once and for all and say, no, we're not going to do this. Now, as far as the financial reset, we know that the Federal Reserve and all these other fiat banks that are around the world, they are in deep trouble, because they've gotten to the point where they've made so much money out of thin air. They are literally killing themselves along with these derivatives. And there also, our hidden tax is the devaluation of our currency.
That's right.
And everybody knows that you can't buy what you could. It's basically 3 or 4 cents worth of a dollar now that we had 100 years ago. It used to be 100 years ago, a man could work for a couple of years, save his money, and build a house and have it completely paid for.
That's right.
That's long, long gone now. And one of the things that I really like about Trump is, recently he's really been blasting the Fed again. And I hope that's a precursor to saying, you know what, we got to get rid of this system. Now, if they decide, okay, if the bright idea is we're going to get rid of this fiat currency and replace it with some fiat coin, that's not good either. But it seems to me that's the direction that it's going, is that, Trump is very much vilifying the Fed and saying that who's the worst. I saw a tweet recently. It said, who's the worst enemy, China or the Fed? I mean, that's unprecedented. Yeah. No politician has ever said anything like that before. So there has to be a reason why that is. And I hope that it doesn't mean that we're going to do away with the current system and bring this cryptocurrency system in line, and everybody will be on the blockchain. And
Trump hates the cryptos. He hates.
I hope that's true. Yeah, I hope that's true.
He's not a crypto fan. He wants, which is why the exchanges are starting to disappear in the U.S., because he wants the IRS involved. He wants that money taxed. When you pull it out of that exchange, they want their pound of flesh, right? So he's not a fan of the crypto. Trump, if you know Trump and understand kind of his mythology, Trump sees himself as the reincarnation of Apollo. He's a sun god, right? He's a Leo rising, Mars on the ascendant. If you've ever seen the penthouse suite in Trump Tower, it's a shrine to Apollo. So Trump is very into gold, right?
Interesting.
So gold is going to play a role in this. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to be gold certificates, actually gold assets, but gold will play a role in some level of reordering. But I'll tell you this: if you and I were to have a conversation 7 years from now, when Uranus goes into Gemini, we'll be talking about how different the economy is, how different purchasing is, and maybe perhaps even different models that have come up in order to circumnavigate perhaps the system and the system's way of exchanging currency. We might even see that. We're creative, we're innovative, we can figure stuff out. And as long as we don't get stepped on, if a bunch of people think about something at the same time, it's really hard to squash your early adopter. And I feel like we have the potential for that. But we're gonna go through a currency change. It's inevitable with Uranus in Taurus. So people need to be prepared for that. What does that mean? It means that you should probably have a basket of assets, whatever they are. They could be gold, they could be silver, they could be food. Whatever those basket of assets are, you need to probably stay on top of them and try to build them up a little bit so you don't get hit in any one single area of your portfolio.
Yeah, and it's so hard to say, and this is a tough conversation to have because a lot of people just don't want to go there. We don't want to think that things are just going to, go in a very negative direction. And again, we have to keep reiterating that we are the ones that need to come up with the ideas. And I think operating on a local level is very powerful. And ultimately, that's where the power is supposed to be if we really went by the Constitution that, they give lip service to, but really doesn't have much of an effect these days, is that your local sheriff is the ultimate authority locally as far as, creating protection for people and upholding the law and that kind of thing. And we've gotten away from that to where this federal monster is in charge. And but I often thought that if we had local, let's just say a bank that was local to each maybe county or something like that, and rather than having the Fed create money out of thin air for their own benefit, for their own manipulation, why not have a local bank that is highly monitored and transparent? Say, okay, if we're going to create money, we're going to create it for the benefit of the people. We're going to build infrastructure. We're going to loan money at no interest to local businesses so they can begin to start. I mean, I think things like that could be highly beneficial where if we kind of localize the financial system to where, we've already got banks creating money out of thin air, and people need to understand that they do that. They've been doing that. That's why our currency is so devalued, because they've made up so much funny money, and they've been able to use that money to manipulate and buy people to get what they want. Mm-hmm. But if we can localize that and make it transparent to where it can't be manipulated, maybe that's not possible. I don't know. But I think about a solution like that could be workable at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had the right asset base, that there was a real asset base, meaning that there was something over here that represented the value of this thing over here. Then I think even if it was, not infinite, let's say there were a half a dozen people who wanted to form like a trust or a foundation, and that has this kind of frontispiece as the bank, and they're using various parcels of land, this and that, and that becomes sort of the collateral of the foundation to create a bank. I think that could work, and then people that would participate in that bank could actually contribute to that asset base so that they could actually grow it and make it perhaps even bigger and have more asset base sort of available to them. I think that that's very, very doable. But what it would take about 5 or 6 highly placed people who have the assets that they could contribute to that and manage them and make it a part of the community. I think that'd be very doable.
Yeah. So I think it behooves all of us to be thinking in creative terms and thinking about solutions and, sharing them with other people as much as possible. So Robert, we've only got a couple more minutes left. Can you give us you've given us our forecast for the next few months or so. What do you see beyond that? You mentioned kind of some major overhauls happening in 2024, 2025. Have you looked beyond that, or is that?
Yeah. So I think there's a really going into 2024. That is when Saturn goes into the sign of Pisces, and then Neptune will already be in Pisces. And like I said, that's a period that represents a kind of socialistic bandwidth. Beyond that, in 2025, Neptune finally changes signs. It gets into Aries. Pluto's in Aquarius. Uranus is in Gemini. Neptune is in Aries. And we have no Earth, anything grounding us with the outer planets. And that's when I think, a lot of the AI stuff, a lot of the CRISPR stuff, a lot of the things that are in Pandora's box begin to emerge. And that 2025 to 2028, 2029 period, that's going to be very unusual and quite surreal. In 2029, Saturn moves into Taurus, and I believe we begin to kind of reorient around something new, a new version of what we would theoretically call reality. And it's going to be much more grounded than that period that precedes it. That period precedes it. I mean, we're talking Philip K. Dick, Blade Runner. It's going to get strange. We've only got a few minutes left, but people are kind of on the edge right now, and they're talking about mental health a lot. It's a big topic of conversation in the public forum. There's a reason for that, because they want people to be able to wrap their heads around where they want to steer this thing.
Yeah. Robert, thank you so much. This has been super informative. I'm hoping that you'll come back and join us at some time in the future and share your insights with us. It's been a great show. I'd like to thank all of our listeners and everybody that's been in the chat room. We really enjoyed the show today, and want to wish everybody a happy rest of their day. And you've been listening to Inside the Matrix with Robert Phoenix. Everybody, take care.
This is Inside the Matrix, hosted by Jimmy Brent.
Who are we talking about?
Jimmy Brent. Jimmy Brent. Jimmy Brent. Live every Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
It is worldwide.
Broadcasting from an undisclosed location deep within the neon capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. For more information on the host and the show, please visit InsideTheMatrix.org. That's InsideTheMatrix.org. It's time to break the chains of manipulated consciousness and claim our true nature as creative divine beings. Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.